Hello, I'm Esther Githu-Ewart. Welcome to Africa 54. Here's what's coming up. U.S. President Joe Biden delivers his final speech to the 79th United Nations General Assembly. Israel launches massive new airstrikes against Hezbollah militants in Lebanon, escalating fears that the conflict will spread across the Middle East. And in our health report, there is concern as women and girls accounted for 63% of all new sub-Saharan HIV infections in 2022. All this and much more coming up on today's Africa 54. U.S. President Joe Biden delivered his final speech to the United Nations General Assembly in New York on Tuesday. The president gave his speech amid several ongoing wars as a backdrop: Russia's war in Ukraine, Israel's fight against Hamas and Hezbollah, and the war in Sudan as the government battles the rapid support forces.
Have stood together, turned the page. We turned the page on the worst pandemic in a century. We made sure COVID no longer controls our lives. We defended the UN Charter and ensured the survival of Ukraine as a free nation. I know many look at the world today and see difficulties and react with despair, but I do not. I won't. As leaders, we don't have the luxury. I recognize the challenges from Ukraine to Gaza to Sudan and beyond. War, hunger, terrorism, brutality, record displacement of people, a climate crisis, democracy at risk, strains within our societies, the promise of artificial intelligence and its significant risk. The list goes on. But maybe because all I've seen and all we have done together over the decades, I have hope. I know there is a way forward.
As world leaders gather in New York, the situation in Sudan is getting worse amid a major humanitarian crisis. There are reports coming out of El Fasher and North Darfur about the RSF possibly doing a full attack on the city. Hunger and famine are on the rise all across Sudan. Filippo Grandi, UN High Commissioner for Refugees, spoke to VOA UN correspondent Margaret Bashir about the deepening crisis and dire situation in the East African nation.
I am very, very worried indeed. Already a few months ago, I was wondering, can it get any worse? It is getting worse. It's exactly along the tracks you mentioned: hunger, terrible violations of human rights, civilians impacted in so many different ways by this terrible conflict, and displaced in ever-growing numbers. There's now well over 10 million people that were forced out of their homes, many of them inside Sudan, where we try to help them if we can reach them. That's a big challenge. And at least 2 million who have gone outside the country as refugees into neighboring countries that have colossal problems of their own, are very fragile, like South Sudan, like Chad, for example. So it's really a major humanitarian crisis, perhaps the biggest in size today in the world, but certainly not the one that attracts most attention and most resources. You ask whether we cope. We always have to try and cope, but it's a struggle.
For more on the U.S. President's speech to the United Nations General Assembly and the crisis in Sudan, I'm joined live from New York by VOA's UN correspondent Margaret Bashir. Margaret, we've heard from President Biden in his last address to the UNGA, but what were the key takeaways from his speech?
Well, just carrying forward from what Mr. Grandi was saying, President Biden also raised Sudan in his speech. He had a message for the two rival generals there causing all the suffering. He said it is time to stop arming the generals and to speak with one voice in the international community. They are tearing the country apart. They must stop blocking humanitarian aid and end this war now. And he made those comments to loud applause in the General Assembly Hall.
Margaret, what about remarks from the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres?
Well, before I get to the Secretary General, I'll just tell you a little more than aside from Sudan. He spoke, President Biden really was giving a farewell address. He talked a lot about what his administration has done, working with the UN, getting back to multilateralism, rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, for instance, after President Trump had withdrawn from it, rejoining the World Health Organization and other UN agencies. He gave a lesson as an elder statesman. He said that when he first got into politics in 1972, that the U.S. was mired in the Vietnam War. But here we are 50 years later, we are partners with Vietnam and friends. And he said things can get better and we should not forget that, which I think was a powerful comment right now with so many wars and such going on in the world. Secretary General Antonio Guterres struck a grim note in his address. It's sort of a state of the world that he gives at the beginning, at the opening of the debate. He said that we cannot go on like this. He talked about the various crises from Ukraine and Gaza, but also in the Horn of Africa and across the Sahel. And he talked about development being off track, climate goals being off track, and he called for ceasefire in Gaza and Sudan and other places where we are seeing suffering on a mass scale.
Margaret, definitely very good addition there about President Biden's last speech at the UNGA. But let's go to Africa now. Which African head of state is going to be addressing at the UNGA maybe in the next hour or so?
We are, and he's not up there yet, we're about to hear from South African President Cyril Ramaphosa. We will hear later from the Nigerian Vice President, from the President of Sierra Leone. Let's see who else is on our list. I think those are the main ones today from Africa, but it should be noted we're going to hear from 194 speakers this week, and only 19 of them are going to be women. And the Secretary General said that that is unacceptable in this day and age, that there must be more representation of women in the high levels of power and decision making.
Margaret, excellent reporting. VOA UN correspondent Margaret Bishia live for us from the UN headquarters in New York. Lebanese health officials say that Monday and Tuesday airstrikes by Israel have killed at least 558 people. VOA's Catherine Gibson has more from Washington.
Israel striking more than 800 targets in Lebanon Monday, including the capital, Beirut, causing thousands to flee. Israel's Iron Dome intercepted rockets from Lebanon late Monday, but fears of a broader conflict in the Middle East remain. U.S. President Joe Biden telling reporters at the White House the United States is working with its counterparts in the region.
And we're working to de-escalate in a way that allows people to return to their homes safely.
Last week, Israel carried out an assassination operation using remotely controlled pagers that exploded, killing members of Hezbollah, a U.S.-designated terrorist group. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed to continue Israel's military campaigns.
We do not wait for a threat. We anticipate it. Anywhere, in any arena, at any time. We eliminate senior officials. We eliminate terrorists. We eliminate missiles. And there's more to come.
Israeli military spokesperson Daniel Hagari warned Lebanese civilians on Monday to stay away from military depots.
Hezbollah intends to launch these weapons towards Israel, and we will not allow it. Stay away from them for your own protection.
The airstrikes prompted an emergency meeting of Lebanon's cabinet and warnings from the United Nations.
What we've seen over the last week has been dramatic. The consequences on civilians has been huge.
And while the White House said Monday it continues to seek a diplomatic solution, one analyst told VOA a ceasefire of the nearly year-old war between Israel and Hamas looks increasingly unlikely.
A possible ceasefire in Gaza is not the solution anymore because it's just not happening. So I think U.S. other diplomatic efforts, not clear how they will succeed in that.
The conflict began last October 7th when U.S. designated terror group Hamas attacked Israel, killing more than 1,000 people and taking 250 people hostage. Israel's military response has killed more than 41,000 in Gaza, according to the territory's health ministry, which does not distinguish between combatants and civilians in its count. Catherine Gibson, VOA News.
For the latest on the Israeli airstrikes in Lebanon, I'm joined live from Beirut by Patricia Hoda, a Lebanese journalist and analyst. Patricia, update us on what's happening in areas controlled by Hezbollah militants.
It started 48 hours ago, and now the Israelis, it's the fourth round of bombing of the Israelis. So we have until now 558 dead and 1,835 people who are wounded. This is exactly in 48 hours. This is half the toll that was during 33 days of war in 2006. So what's happening? The Israelis are targeting, they are saying that they are targeting the weapons of Hezbollah, the medium range and the long range weapons. But in the meantime, you have a lot of civilians who are fleeing the areas, especially South Lebanon, that is being really very intensively bombed.
Patricia, where are they going? We've seen those traffic jams on the streets of Beirut, but where are they heading?
They didn't have time. Yesterday, for example, they didn't have time to organize themselves. They were waiting, for example, parents were waiting for their kids and things like this. Today, it is more organized. The Lebanese government opened 250 public schools. They were saying, the people fleeing South Lebanon, they were saying we are going to the southern suburb, which is the threshold of Hezbollah in Beirut, or to the Bekaa Valley, which is as well being bombed by the Israelis. So they were saying this, but I think that they will be staying in schools in Mount Lebanon and in Beirut. They are now in these schools, especially in Saida, because Saida is the area, because you showed some pictures. Saida is the area where it's the entrance and the exit of South Lebanon. So people are being blocked there because you have a lot of traffic jam.
Very quickly, Patricia, are there concerns that the airstrikes targeting Hezbollah might spill over to other parts of Lebanon?
We are always scared of this, but how it seems and what the Israelis are saying, and if we compare it to the war of 2006, it might be only targeted sharing on Hezbollah's weapons, and because the Israelis, they want the 1701 resolution to be implemented, and this a resolution where they want on their border no weapons and no militias. So this is what they are trying to do. We don't know what will happen, but until now, if we compare it to 2006, the Israelis didn't bomb the infrastructure or the airport or whatsoever. They are really targeting Hezbollah. Hezbollah positions.
Patricia, many thanks for your reporting. Patricia Hoda is a Lebanese journalist and analyst. Overshadowed by the wars in Ukraine, the Middle East and Sudan, conflict in the Sahel rarely garners global headlines, yet it is contributing to a sharp rise in migration from the region towards Europe at a time when anti-immigrant far-right parties are on the rise and some European Union states are tightening their borders. According to the International Organization for Migration, the route to Europe with the steepest rise in numbers this year is via West African coastal nations to Spain's Canary Islands. IOM data shows the number of migrants arriving in Europe from Sahel countries rose 62% to over 17,000 in the first 6 months of 2024, up from nearly 11,000 1 year earlier. The UN and the IOM are blaming the rise on conflict and climate change. The last 2 U.S. service members left Niger last week as part of America's military withdrawal following the country's July 2023 coup, an agreement reached between the two countries. For more insight into the implications of this military fallout, VOA's Paul Ndiho spoke to Edgar Gidua, an international security and diplomatic expert at Strathmore University in Nairobi, Kenya.
The U.S. withdrawing from the Sahel region is largely because of 2 factors. Number one, like you rightly said, the coup d'etats. So the U.S. is a big proponent of democratic ideals. So the U.S. would not want to be seen to be operating in a theater where the government of the day is not legitimate because, they have gotten power through the power of the gun. So there is that to think about. Number 2, state sovereignty, the concept of sovereignty. When these countries, Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, asked the US and by extension France to withdraw, they were invoking their sovereignty. They were invoking the rights they have as sovereign countries. We control the affairs that occur in our soil. So the US has got no choice but to honor the request of a sovereign country. If they do not want your help, then you have no choice but to withdraw. And 2, remember, you're also withdrawing because it means leaving your troops there, you are endangering them also because they are, quote unquote, staying in a hostile environment, in an environment where they are not needed. If you remember watching the documentaries across those 3 countries, people are demonstrating, we want the US off, we want France off. So you do not want to leave your troops in an area where you're going to also expose them to physical harm. So the US has done the right thing, in my view, in terms of obeying the concept of sovereignty and walking out because those countries have requested and told you to leave.
How about the fact that when they leave a vacuum, and we've seen in some cases where once they left, the Russians or the Wagner group took over some of those spots that were held by these multinational forces, including the United States.
By the danger of the US and by extension France vacating and leaving the Sahel region is that power does not love vacuums. If one power leaves, another power will take that vacuum. And you've seen what the Wagner group have done. The Russians, now renamed the Africa Corps, they have come in to help or to claim to help Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger to fight the jihadists. The Wagner group have gone there. They have committed atrocities that should actually be really looked into. So what if the Sahel really has a serious debate with itself? It has replaced, quote unquote, a neo-colonial master who was benevolent to another person, even though they're not claiming they are your master, but they are really literally coming to take advantage of your weaknesses and your vulnerability. So Russia is not going to be any better in the Sahel region. Russia has proven to be a very, very unfriendly and very unreliable partner, both in security, in food security, you name it. So the Sahel will only get themselves in problems. And Paul, if you've been following news, it's recently, like a month or 2 ago, the Russian mercenaries who were beaten up by jihadists, exactly, they were chased. So the question becomes, what military aid did they bring if they were going to be made to flee and run? Better the devil that you know than the angel you do not, because the Russians are going to be worse for the security architecture of the Sahel.
Edgar Gidua is an international security and diplomatic expert at Strathmore University in Nairobi, Kenya. Still to come, there is concern as women and girls account for 63% of all new sub-Saharan HIV infections in 2022. We'll be right back.
This week on Straight Talk Africa, world leaders are gathered in New York, where the United Nations General Assembly is underway. What is the Africa delegation to UNGA hoping to achieve? Is the Summit for the Future going to make a difference for Africans? Join me, Peter Clotty, and my guests in New York as we tackle these questions on the next Straight Talk Africa.
In other news, the Senegalese military says at least 30 bodies were found on a boat drifting off their coast. The Navy was informed of the vessel's presence on Sunday evening and sent out a boat patrol to the area 70 kilometers from Dakar. And health authorities in war-torn Sudan say cholera is spreading, killing at least 388 people and sickening about 13,000 others over the past 2 months amid more than 17 months of fighting between the military and the rapid support forces. Cholera is a highly contagious infection that can cause death within hours if not treated. It's time for a health report, and joining us now is Africa 54 health correspondent Lino Mudu with the latest on chemicals in food packaging. Hello, Lino.
Hello, Esther. Hello, everyone. A new study conducted by researchers in Switzerland reveals that over 3,600 chemicals used in food packaging or preparation have been detected in human bodies, some of which are hazardous to health. Among the high concern chemicals were numerous PFAs, synthetic chemicals, also known as forever chemicals, which have been detected in many parts of the human body. PFAs can cause damage to the liver and the immune system, low birth weight, and birth defects. Also detected was a bisphenol, a hormone-disrupting chemical used to make plastics that has already been banned from baby bottles in many countries. The study was published in the Journal of Exposure Science and Environmental Epidemiology. UN member states, activists, and policymakers are at the UNGA. UNAIDS is hosting a special event to seek more funding into new HIV prevention technologies for people at risk of HIV infection. According to UNAIDS, women and girls accounted for 63% of all new HIV infections in 2022 in sub-Saharan Africa. For more insight, I spoke in an exclusive interview with Winnie Byanyima, the Executive Director of UNAIDS.
The global AIDS response is one of the most successful stories of multilateralism. So I'm here at the United Nations first to showcase global solidarity at its best. That 25 years ago, the world came together, rich and poor countries all over the world, they came together here and agreed to fight together. They put up a program. This is the program I lead, the joint program that would set the direction, show the targets, bring the data, and advocate for the policies to end AIDS. They put together a global fund, and the American government set up its own program called PEPFAR. All of that together has led to a world where 3/4 of the people living with HIV are on treatment. But we still have 9.3 million people who are not on treatment, 1.3 million new infections last year. We need to close that tab. So I'm here first to say the world can come together at the United Nations and achieve a big goal like ending a disease. 2, to say, but we are close to ending it, but we are not there. We must sustain the gains and accelerate progress and achieve that target in 2030.
What are your hopes in terms of achieving the 2030 goals when it comes to curbing the incidence of HIV/AIDS?
We have at least 6 countries that have achieved the midterm goals of 2025. That is achieving the treatment targets. So we believe it's achievable, but there are 3 things that need to happen. 1, the financial constraint, what I've mentioned, debt reduction, to open up resources to invest. And that investment isn't just in HIV, it is investment also in education of girls, it's investment in the broader health system. We need the science to reach the people. We need to get these new revolutionary, transformative tools of prevention and treatment like lenacapavir, which can actually also be developed into a treatment, an ARV for treatment. So we need to move that quickly. So we need to work around these barriers of intellectual property and get the price down. And third, we need to have the policies in place that enable everyone, irrespective of their sexual orientation, their age, their race, to come forward and get the tools they need.
Talk to us about the significance of young people's voice in the global fight against HIV, and particularly in Africa.
We have 1.3 million new infections every year. Most of those new infections are of young people. And in Africa, the number of young girls, and young women being infected is 3 to 4 times more than the number of their counterparts, boys and young men. So we must focus on why young women are at a higher risk of infection than boys and men. We must find the solutions for them. So we brought 2 young women here who are living with HIV and who can talk about, this is not a death sentence, I'm on treatment, how do I get my treatment? How do I deal with stigma and discrimination? How do I survive? And this is a powerful message to the member states here, governments here, about the importance of addressing this issue of 3,100 girls infected every week in Africa.
As a leader, an African woman, and also as a mother, what will you tell young people today? What message can you share to help them better understand that they need to protect themselves?
What I would say to our young people in Africa is that Africa is a continent of opportunity, and that they are privileged to be born and to be living in Africa. They should value their lives. And despite the challenges, political, economic, social, it is growing, and they are the ones growing it. So protecting their health is critical. Having sex and enjoying it is a good thing, but you have to do it with care. You have to know how to protect yourself, get the information, and get what you need. Condom, PrEP, every now and then, check, test, and see that you are healthy and that you have not acquired HIV. If you have, get on treatment. It's not a life sentence. You just take your tablet and you're still okay. So protect your health. Africa needs you.
That's UNAIDS Executive Director Winnie Byanyima. And that's our health report for today. To stay in touch, find me on X at Lenore Moudou. Back to you, Esther.
Thanks, Lenore. Be sure to watch Lenore Moudou's Health Report every Tuesday right here on Africa 54. And thank you, viewers, for joining us today. We'll see you back tomorrow.